The early morning sun cast long shadows across San Francisco International Airport's first-class lounge as one of the world's most successful yet humble tech entrepreneurs sat quietly in a corner, sipping his regular black coffee. Mr. Anderson wasn't your typical billionaire. No designer suits or flashy watches. Instead, he wore what made him comfortable. A well-worn pair of jeans, his favorite navy blue sweater, and simple running shoes. His mother's words still echoed in his mind, even after all these years of success. "Son, your character speaks louder than your clothes." Those words had guided him through building his tech empire from scratch, turning a small coding project in his garage into a company now worth billions. But today, like most days, he chose to blend in with the crowd rather than stand out. Looking around the lounge, he noticed the usual morning rush. Business people in crisp suits tapping away on their laptops, families heading off on vacation, and flight crews walking briskly to their gates. He smiled, remembering his first flight 15 years ago, when he could barely afford a basic economy ticket. Now his software powered the booking systems of most major airlines across the country, including the very one he was about to board. Checking his watch, Mr. Anderson gathered his simple carry-on bag, the same one he'd been using for the past 5 years. Inside was his laptop, where he'd been working on his company's newest project, an artificial intelligence system that would revolutionize how customer service worked across all industries. It was his passion project, born from his own experiences of being judged by his appearance rather than his capabilities. As the boarding call for his flight to New York echoed through the lounge, he took one last sip of his coffee and headed toward the gate. The morning crowds parted and flowed around him, no one giving him a second glance. That's exactly how he liked it. Despite his net worth of $4.2 billion, he believed true respect wasn't bought with flashy displays of wealth, but earned through actions and character. Walking down the jet bridge, he quietly hummed his mother's favorite song, the same one she used to sing in their tiny apartment above her hair salon, where she'd raised him alone while working double shifts. Every step in his success story was built on her sacrifices and wisdom, and he carried those lessons with him everywhere. The smell of fresh coffee and leather seats greeted him as he stepped onto the plane. First class was still relatively empty, with just a few early passengers settling in. He double-checked his boarding pass, seat 2A, by the window. It was going to be a long flight to New York, but he had plans to use the time productively, reviewing the latest updates to his company's bias elimination software. Little did he know, this routine business flight was about to become anything but ordinary. As he stored his bag in the overhead compartment, he caught a glimpse of a flight attendant giving him an odd look. He'd seen that look before, the one that questioned whether he belonged in first class. With a small smile, he settled into his seat, opened his laptop, and prepared for what would turn out to be one of the most memorable flights of his life. The cabin crew began their pre-flight preparations, and more passengers filed in, some doing double takes at his casual attire in the first-class cabin. But Mr. Anderson remained focused on his work, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he reviewed code that would, ironically, help prevent the very situation that was about to unfold. The first-class cabin was beginning to fill up when Ms. Reynolds, a senior flight attendant with 20 years of experience, first noticed him. She'd served countless passengers over her career, from movie stars to business executives, and prided herself on knowing exactly who belonged where. But something about the man in seat 2A made her pause. He was absorbed in his laptop work, wearing clothes that looked like they came from a department store rather than the designer boutiques she was used to seeing in first class. Her eyes narrowed as she watched him, years of built-up assumptions clouding her judgment. She'd seen her share of passengers trying to sneak into upgraded seats, and something just didn't feel right to her. Making her way down the aisle with practiced efficiency, she stopped beside his seat. Her voice carried a hint of superiority as she spoke, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Sir, I believe there might be some confusion. This is the first-class cabin. May I see your boarding pass?" Mr. Anderson looked up from his laptop, his expression calm and composed. He'd been in situations like this before, and his mother's words about dignity rang in his ears. Without saying a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, holding it up with a steady hand. Ms. Reynolds made a show of examining the ticket, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the paper. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor," she announced, her tone suggesting she was doing everyone a favor. Several passengers had stopped their pre-flight routines to watch the scene unfold, some shaking their heads in disapproval, though it wasn't clear whether at him or the flight attendant. A businessman across the aisle had already pulled out his phone, discreetly recording the interaction. 2 rows back, an elderly couple whispered to each other, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. A young woman in a business suit looked up from her Kindle, her face showing a mix of concern and recognition. Something about the man in 2 seemed familiar to her. Ms. Reynolds turned on her heel, boarding pass in hand, her heels clicking purposefully as she strode toward the front of the cabin. "I'll be right back, sir," she called over her shoulder, the "sir" carrying a note of doubt that everyone in the cabin could hear. Mr. Anderson returned to his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. On the screen was an email from his development team about their new AI software, ironically, a program designed to detect and prevent biased treatment in customer service situations. He couldn't help but smile at the timing. Other flight attendants bustled past, stealing glances at him while trying to appear busy with their pre-flight duties. A few first-class passengers who had witnessed the scene shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man in an expensive suit even cleared his throat and leaned forward, about to say something in Mr. Anderson's defense, but stopped when he saw the slight shake of Mr. Anderson's head. Through the cabin's mounting tension, Mr. Anderson remained remarkably peaceful. He built his entire career on staying calm under pressure, on proving people wrong through actions rather than arguments. His company's success hadn't come from fighting every battle, but from choosing the right moments to make a difference. As Ms. Reynolds' footsteps approached again, this time accompanied by what sounded like multiple sets of feet, Mr. Anderson saved his work and closed his laptop. He knew what was coming next would either be a moment of embarrassment for the flight attendant or an opportunity for something more meaningful. Either way, he was prepared to handle it with the same grace and wisdom that had taken him from a small apartment above a hair salon to the boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies. The faces of nearby passengers showed a mix of emotions: anticipation, concern, curiosity, as they waited to see what would unfold. Little did they know, they were about to witness something that would soon go viral and change more lives than just those on this flight. The tension in the first-class cabin reached its peak as Ms. Reynolds returned with the flight supervisor, Mrs. Baker, close behind. The supervisor's expression shifted from professional concern to shock as she caught sight of the passenger in seat 2A. Her steps faltered, and the color drained from her face as recognition dawned. "Oh my goodness," Mrs. Baker whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Mr. Anderson, I'm so terribly sorry about this confusion." She turned to Ms. Reynolds, whose confident demeanor was beginning to crack. "This gentleman isn't just a first-class passenger. His company developed the entire booking system our airline uses. In fact, half the airlines in the country run on his software." The revelation rippled through the cabin. Several passengers gasped softly, and the young woman with the Kindle suddenly sat up straighter, now remembering where she'd seen his face. On the cover of last month's Business Weekly. The businessman who'd been recording quickly lowered his phone, looking slightly embarrassed. Ms. Reynolds stood frozen, her perfectly maintained composure crumbling as the reality of her mistake sank in. Her face flushed red, and she gripped her hands together tightly. I didn't realize," she stammered, her earlier superiority evaporating into mortification. But before anyone could say more, Mr. Anderson raised his hand gently. "Please," he said, his voice warm and steady. "Would you both sit down for a moment?" He gestured to the empty seat beside him and the one across the aisle. The other passengers watched in surprised silence as both flight attendants hesitated, then slowly took the offered seats. "You know," he began, his voice carrying naturally through the quiet cabin, 20 years ago, I was on my first flight ever. Economy class, last row, right by the bathroom." He smiled at the memory. "I was wearing a suit I'd borrowed from my uncle, trying so hard to look like I belonged. But you know what? The flight attendant on that plane didn't care what I was wearing. She treated me with the same respect she showed everyone else." He opened his laptop, turning it so both flight attendants could see the screen. "This is what my team and I have been working on for the past year. It's an AI system designed to help people recognize and overcome unconscious bias in customer service. But it's not just about technology, it's about the human element, about learning to see beyond our first impressions." A few rows back, an older gentleman dabbed at his eyes with his handkerchief. The businessman who'd been recording had put his phone away completely and was now leaning forward, completely engaged. Even the children in the cabin had gone quiet, sensing the importance of the moment. Ms. Reynolds looked down at her hands, then back up at Mr. Anderson. "I made a terrible assumption," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I treated you unfairly. I'm truly sorry." Mr. Anderson nodded thoughtfully. "You know what's remarkable about this moment?" he asked, looking around the cabin. "It's not just about me, or you, or this flight. It's about all the times this happens when there isn't a billionaire involved to make it go viral. It's about the everyday people who face these assumptions, but don't have the platform to speak up." The cabin had transformed from a space of tension to one of reflection. Passengers who had been awkwardly avoiding eye contact were now engaged in the conversation, some nodding in understanding, others looking thoughtful. Mrs. Baker cleared her throat. "Mr. Anderson, I want you to know that this will be a learning moment for our entire airline. We can do better, and we will do better." As the flight attendants stood to resume their duties, the atmosphere in the cabin had changed completely. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had become something much more meaningful. A moment of genuine human connection and understanding. And this was just the beginning of what would become a much bigger story. As the plane reached cruising altitude, something remarkable began to unfold in the first-class cabin. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation was transforming into an open dialogue that nobody had expected. A well-dressed woman in her 50s spoke up first, her voice carrying years of similar experiences. "I run a chain of successful restaurants," she shared, leaning forward in her seat. "But just last month, at a suppliers meeting, someone assumed I was part of the cleaning staff." She caught Mr. Anderson's eye and nodded. "It doesn't matter what you achieve. Some people see what they want to see." The businessman who had been recording earlier cleared his throat. "I've been guilty of this myself," he admitted, surprising everyone with his honesty. "When I started my company, I passed over some incredible candidates because they didn't fit my image of what an executive should look like. Looking back, I realize how many talented people we probably lost because of those assumptions." Mr. Anderson listened intently to each story, his laptop now showing a presentation about his company's new AI project. The screen displayed statistics about bias in customer service, but the numbers were becoming more than just data points. They were coming alive through the stories being shared. A young tech professional spoke up from the back of the first-class cabin. "I've been following your company's work," she said to Mr. Anderson. "But I never realized how personal this mission was for you. It's one thing to build software that fights bias, but seeing it play out in real life." She gestured around the cabin. "This makes it real." Ms. Reynolds, who had been quietly attending to her duties, paused near Mr. Anderson's seat again. This time, her approach was different. Humble, genuine. "Could you tell us more about how your system works?" she asked. "I mean, if we're going to learn from this, really learn, I want to understand." Mr. Anderson smiled warmly and turned his laptop so everyone could see better. The technology is complex, but the principle is simple, he explained. It's like having a friend who gently taps you on the shoulder when you're about to make an assumption based on how someone looks, dresses, or speaks. The system doesn't judge, it just helps us pause and think. The elderly couple who had been watching everything unfold shared a knowing look. The husband spoke up, his voice gentle with wisdom. In our day, we didn't have fancy computers to tell us when we were being unfair. We had to learn the hard way, through mistakes and regrets. Maybe that's why this feels so important. We're finally seeing tools that could help people do better. As the conversation continued, flight attendants from economy class found excuses to pass through first class, word having spread throughout the plane about what was happening. Each passing crew member slowed down just enough to catch a bit of the discussion, some even taking notes on their service pads. Mrs. Baker, who had been coordinating with the cockpit, returned to announce that the captain himself was impressed by what was happening in the cabin. He's asked if we could share the key points of this discussion during our next crew training, she said, her professional demeanor now mixed with genuine enthusiasm. The cabin had become a kind of impromptu classroom, but not the stuffy, formal kind. It was the sort of natural learning that happens when people open their hearts and minds to each other's experiences. Mr. Anderson's simple decision to respond with grace rather than anger had created a space where real change felt possible. A student sitting in one of the last first-class rows raised her hand tentatively. "My social media is already blowing up with video clips from earlier," she said, holding up her phone. "People are asking what happened next. They want to know how this story ends." Mr. Anderson looked around the cabin, taking in all the engaged faces. "I don't think this is about how the story ends," he said thoughtfully. "I think this is about how a new story begins." The mood in the first-class cabin shifted again when Mr. Anderson began sharing his personal story. He spoke softly, but his words carried weight that held everyone's attention. The tale of his journey from a tiny apartment above his mother's hair salon to the heights of the tech world wasn't just about success. It was about persistence and dignity in the face of prejudice. "My mother worked 14-hour days," he recalled, his eyes distant with memory. "She always told me, how people treat you is their story. How you respond is yours." I didn't fully understand what she meant until I started pitching my software to companies. He paused, letting out a small chuckle. "I can't count how many times I was asked if I was the delivery person when I showed up for meetings." The young tech professional who had spoken earlier leaned forward. "But your company was revolutionary," she said. "Your booking software changed the entire airline industry. How did you handle the rejection?" Mr. Anderson's face lit up with a warm smile. "I learned to let my work speak for itself. When people wouldn't take meetings with me, I'd send detailed proposals. When they assumed I was just a small-time programmer, I'd show them test results. Eventually, the results were too good to ignore." Ms. Reynolds, who had been listening intently, wiped a tear from her corner of her eye. "And here I am, using your software every day to check in passengers, never knowing the story behind it. Never thinking about. That's exactly why this moment matters," Mr. Anderson said gently. "It's not about making anyone feel guilty. It's about opening our eyes to see each person's full story." The businessman who had been recording earlier raised his hand like a student in class. "You mentioned your new AI project. How did you come up with the idea?" Mr. Anderson turned his laptop screen toward the group again. "Picture this. A system that doesn't just process transactions but helps build understanding. It started when I noticed how often customer service interactions went wrong because of unconscious bias. Not just about race, but age, dress, accent. Any difference that might make someone jump to conclusions." A flight attendant who had wandered in from economy class spoke up. "Like assuming someone doesn't belong in first class because they're dressed casually?" Her comment brought knowing smiles to several faces. "Exactly," Mr. Anderson nodded. "The software analyzes patterns in customer interactions and gives gentle reminders to check our assumptions. It's like having a wise friend who helped you be your better self. The elderly woman, who had been quiet until now, reached across the aisle to pat Ms. Reynolds' hand. We're all learning, dear. Every day is a chance to do better than the day before. As the plane continued its journey eastward, passengers began sharing their own stories of times they'd been judged unfairly or had judged others. Each story added another layer of understanding to the conversation. The cabin had become a safe space for honest reflection. Mr. Anderson's phone buzzed with a message from his office. The video clips from earlier were already trending online. His PR team wanted to know how to handle the situation. He smiled and typed a simple response. Let the story tell itself. Sometimes the best teaching happens through real moments like these. Looking up from his phone, he noticed something remarkable. The invisible barriers that usually divided first-class passengers from each other and the crew had melted away. People were talking, sharing, listening, really listening, to each other's experiences. Ms. Reynolds stood nearby, her posture now relaxed and genuine. You know, she said thoughtfully, when I started my shift today, I thought I knew exactly what my job was about. Now I realize there's so much more to learn. That's the beauty of moments like these, Mr. Anderson replied. They remind us that behind every interaction, there's an opportunity to either build walls or build bridges. He glanced around the cabin at all the engaged faces. Today, I think we're building bridges. As the flight crossed over the Midwest, Mr. Anderson opened a fresh presentation on his laptop. The screen glowed with graphs and charts, but it was the real-world example unfolding in the cabin that truly brought his project to life. Let me show you something interesting, he said, turning the screen so others could see. This is what our AI system picked up in just 1 week of analyzing customer service interactions at a major retail chain, he explained, pointing to a colorful chart. See these patterns? They show how customers were treated differently based on how they dressed or spoke. Ms. Reynolds leaned in closer, her eyes widening as she understood the implications. So the system can actually see when we're not treating everyone fairly. Not just see it, Mr. Anderson replied warmly. It helps prevent it. Imagine if, just before our interaction earlier, you received a gentle reminder to check any assumptions. That's what this does. It's like having a friend who helped you pause and think. The businessman who had been recording earlier raised an interesting point. But how do you get people to accept this kind of feedback without feeling attacked? Mr. Anderson nodded appreciatively at the question. That's exactly what makes this project special. We designed it to be supportive, not punitive. Watch this. He pulled up a simulation showing how the system worked in real time. The screen displayed a typical customer service scenario. As the simulation played out, small prompts appeared, subtle suggestions that helped the service representative recognize and adjust their behavior. The whole cabin watched, fascinated by how technology could help make human interactions more compassionate. The best part, Mr. Anderson continued, is that it learns from positive interactions too. When someone handles a situation particularly well, the system notes that approach for future training. A flight attendant from economy class, who had been listening intently, spoke up. You know, earlier today, before this flight, I caught myself making assumptions about a passenger. I wish I did something like this to remind me to stop and think. The elderly couple who had been watching everything unfold shared a knowing look. In our day, the wife said softly, we didn't have technology to help us be better people. We had to learn the hard way. This feels like progress. As Mr. Anderson continued his demonstration, something beautiful was happening in the cabin. People weren't just watching a presentation. They were seeing themselves in the scenarios, recognizing their own biases and prejudices, and most importantly, seeing a way forward. The young tech professional spoke up again. What amazes me is how you've taken something as cold as computer code and used it to solve such a human problem. It's like you've built a bridge between technology and empathy. Ms. Reynolds, who had been taking notes on her service pad, looked up. Would your company consider working with airlines? I mean, after today, I can see how much we need something like this." Mr. Anderson smiled warmly. "Actually, that's partly why I'm on this flight to New York. We're meeting with several service industry leaders to discuss implementing this system. But I never expected to have such a perfect real-world example to share with them." The businessman who had recorded the earlier interaction raised his hand again. "The video of what happened earlier is going viral. People are calling it a masterclass in handling discrimination with grace. Have you thought about using this as a case study? Sometimes the best teaching moments are the ones we don't plan." Mr. Anderson replied thoughtfully. "What happened today wasn't just about me or Ms. Reynolds. It's about everyone who's ever been judged unfairly and everyone who's ever made unfair judgments." As he spoke, phones around the cabin lit up with notifications. The story was spreading, but it wasn't just about the confrontation anymore. It was about what happened after, the learning, the growth, the possibility of change. It was becoming a moment that would inspire others to think differently about their own assumptions and actions. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed completely from what it had been just hours ago. One by one, passengers began sharing their own experiences with prejudice and bias, each story adding another layer to the powerful conversation that was unfolding. The well-dressed woman who owned restaurants started again. "Just last week," she shared, adjusting her glasses, "I overheard my own staff making assumptions about a customer who came in wearing work clothes. They seated him in the back, away from the windows." She paused, shaking her head. "After he finished his meal, we found out he owned 3 construction companies. But that shouldn't even matter. Everyone deserves the same respect." A young man in a hoodie who had been quiet until now raised his hand. "I'm actually a pediatric surgeon," he said, causing several heads to turn. "The number of times I've been asked if I'm lost when I walk into the doctor's lounge. It gets tiring having to prove yourself over and over." Mr. Anderson nodded understandingly. "That's why we're designing this system to work across different industries. Healthcare, hospitality, retail, the problems are similar everywhere." The tech professional who had been following the conversation closely pulled out her tablet. "Look at this," she said, showing her screen to those nearby. "The video from earlier has over 1 million views already. But what's really interesting are the comments. People are sharing their own stories, thousands of them." Mrs. Baker, the flight supervisor, who had been monitoring the situation, stepped forward. "Our airline's social media team just called. They want to know if you'd be willing to work with us on a training program." Mr. Anderson. "They think what happened today could help change how we approach customer service across our entire network." "You know what's beautiful about this moment?" The elderly gentleman spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. "It's not just about pointing out what went wrong. It's about finding a way to do better. In all my years of flying, I've never seen people talk so openly about these things." Ms. Reynolds, who had been listening intently, stood up straighter. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice stronger now. "Maybe I could help. I mean, who better to talk about learning from mistakes than someone who made one in front of the whole internet?" Her ability to laugh at herself brought warm smiles from around the cabin. A flight attendant from economy class added her perspective. "In our training, we learn all about safety procedures and service protocols. But maybe we need to spend more time learning about people, really seeing them, not just serving them." The student who had mentioned social media earlier looked up from her phone again. "People are already calling this the first-class lesson online. They're saying it's not about where you sit on the plane, but how you treat others no matter where they sit." Mr. Anderson took all this in quietly, watching as his impromptu lesson in human dignity took on a life of its own. His phone buzzed again. His team in New York was saying that morning news shows were requesting interviews. But what made him smile wasn't the publicity. It was seeing real change happen in real time. "You know," he said, addressing everyone in the cabin, Sometimes the best teaching moments come from our hardest mistakes. What matters isn't that we stumbled, but that we learned how to walk better afterward. The businessman who had recorded the initial incident stood up. "I've deleted my recording," he announced. "This isn't about catching someone's bad moment anymore. It's about capturing a moment of change." As the plane began its initial descent toward New York, the conversation showed no signs of slowing. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had blossomed into something none of them could have predicted. A genuine moment of human connection and understanding that was spreading far beyond the confines of their aircraft. As the plane began its descent into New York, Ms. Reynolds approached Mr. Anderson's seat one last time. Her demeanor was completely different now, humble, genuine, and thoughtful. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened," she said, settling into the empty seat beside him. "I'd like to do more than just apologize. I want to help make real change." Mr. Anderson turned toward her with interest. "What did you have in mind?" "Well," she began, straightening her uniform, "I've been a flight attendant for 20 years. I've probably made the same mistake countless times without even realizing it. But today opened my eyes. What if," she paused, gathering her thoughts, "what if I could share my experience with other flight attendants? Show them how easy it is to let bias affect our actions." The flight supervisor, overhearing this, stepped closer. "Actually, that could be perfect. We've been looking for ways to make our diversity training more impactful. Real stories from real people hit harder than any textbook examples." The tech professional chimed in from across the aisle. "That's exactly what makes great training programs work, when they're based on authentic experiences. It's one thing to tell people not to be biased. It's another to hear someone say, 'I made this mistake, and here's what I learned.'" Mr. Anderson opened his laptop one last time. "What if we combined your story with our AI system?" he suggested. "Imagine training sessions where you share your experience, and then we show how our technology could help prevent similar situations." Ms. Reynolds' eyes lit up. "You mean I could help design the training? Use what happened today to help others learn?" "Exactly," Mr. Anderson smiled. "Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned the hardest lessons themselves." The businessman who had deleted his recording spoke up again. "You know, my company could use something like this too. We're always talking about diversity in hiring, but maybe we need to look deeper at how we treat people every day." Around the cabin, other passengers began offering their own suggestions and support. The restaurant owner offered to host training sessions at her venues. The pediatric surgeon volunteered to share his experiences in healthcare settings. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation was transforming into a movement. A flight attendant from economy class rushed forward with excitement. "The pilot just got word from ground staff. There are news crews waiting at the gate. They've heard about what happened and want to cover the story." Mr. Anderson shook his head with a gentle smile. "Let's not focus on the incident itself. Instead, let's talk about what we're going to do next. This isn't about one moment of bias. It's about creating lasting change." Ms. Reynolds took a deep breath. "I'm nervous about being in the spotlight," she admitted. "But if sharing my mistake can help others learn, I'm willing to do it." The elderly couple who had watched everything unfold spoke up again. "Dear," the wife said kindly to Ms. Reynolds, "sometimes our biggest mistakes become our greatest opportunities to make a difference." As the plane touched down in New York, phones throughout the cabin lit up with notifications. The story had indeed gone viral, but not in the way such stories usually do. Instead of angry comments and calls for punishment, people were sharing their own stories of learning and growth. The hashtag first class lesson was trending, but it wasn't about luxury travel. It was about treating everyone with first class respect. Mr. Anderson looked around at the faces in the cabin one last time. What had started as a routine business flight had become something much more significant. In just a few hours, a moment of bias had transformed into an opportunity for real change, proving that sometimes the best teaching moments come from our most uncomfortable situations. 3 months after that memorable flight, the airport conference room was packed with airline staff, industry leaders, and media representatives. Mr. Anderson stood at the podium, but he wasn't alone. Ms. Reynolds stood confidently beside him, ready to help launch their new training program. "When I started my company," Mr. Anderson began, looking across the crowded room, "I dreamed of changing how airlines work. But I never imagined it would happen quite like this." Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. "Today, we're launching something bigger than just a new technology. We're starting a movement." The screen behind them showed clips from their now famous flight, but not the confrontation. Instead, it showed the conversations that followed. The learning, the sharing, the understanding that had blossomed at 30,000 feet. Ms. Reynolds stepped forward to the microphone. Gone was the defensive flight attendant from 3 months ago. In her place stood a confident speaker who had found her calling. "I could have become just another viral video of someone's worst moment," she said. "Instead, I became part of the solution." The training program they unveiled that day was unlike anything the industry had seen before. It combined Mr. Anderson's AI technology with real human experiences. Flight attendants would not only learn from the system, but would also hear from passengers who had faced bias, creating a deep understanding that went beyond simple rules and regulations. In the 3 months since our flight, Ms. Reynolds continued, over 50 airlines have signed up for this program. But it's not just airlines anymore. She gestured to the audience where representatives from hotels, restaurants, and retail chains sat. Every industry that deals with people can learn from what happened that day. The restaurant owner from the flight stood up in the audience. "We've been testing the program in my restaurants for the past month," she shared. "The change in how our staff interacts with customers is remarkable. It's like they've developed a new kind of awareness." The pediatric surgeon who had been on the flight was there too, now consulting with hospitals about implementing similar training. "In medicine, assumptions can be dangerous," he explained. "This program helps us catch those assumptions before they affect patient care." Mr. Anderson clicked to the next slide, showing the impact of their work. The statistics were impressive. Customer satisfaction up, complaints down, and most importantly, a measurable decrease in biased interactions across participating companies. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story," he said warmly. "The real change happens in moments you can't measure, when someone feels welcomed instead of judged, respected instead of dismissed." Ms. Reynolds shared her own update. "Last week, I trained my 100th group of flight attendants. Every time I tell our story, I see the same thing happen. People begin to recognize their own biases and want to do better." The elderly couple from the flight, now regular speakers at training sessions, stood to share their perspective. "We've lived long enough to see many changes in society," the husband said. "But this feels different. This isn't just about rules or policies. It's about changing hearts." As the presentation concluded, Mr. Anderson revealed one final surprise. "Today, we're announcing a scholarship program," he declared. "Every year, we'll fund training for small businesses that couldn't otherwise afford it. Because everyone deserves to be treated with first-class respect, no matter where they go." The room erupted in applause, but the most powerful moment came during the questions. A young flight attendant in training raised her hand and asked Ms. Reynolds, "Weren't you afraid to face everyone after what happened?" Ms. Reynolds smiled warmly. "I was terrified," she admitted. "But I learned that when you own your mistakes and commit to doing better, people will help you grow. That's the real first-class lesson." The conference wrapped up, but the movement it started that day continues to grow. What began as an uncomfortable moment on a routine flight had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the best transformations start with someone brave enough to say, "I was wrong, and I want to do better."